What if the most restricted continent on Earth is restricted for a reason that has nothing to do with the scientific research stations sitting on its surface? What if the ice that covers Antarctica, 2 miles thick in places, has been hiding something for thousands of years that a small group of governments discovered in the 1940s and have been actively suppressing ever since? What if the reason 7 of the world's most powerful nations rushed to divide territorial claims over a frozen desert at the bottom of the world was not about scientific access, but about controlling what lies underneath? If this mystery is pulling you in, please like and subscribe and turn on your notifications so you never miss an investigation. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We are reading every single one. What if the maps that show Antarctica's coastline in accurate detail, drawn by cartographers who lived 300 years before the continent was officially discovered, were not guesses or errors, but copies of something much older, made by people who had actually been there when the ice was not? And what if the answer to that question is sitting right now under 2 miles of Antarctic ice, in a landscape that governments have agreed by international treaty to keep off limits to independent investigation? This is what this investigation is about. And the deeper you go into what is actually known about Antarctica, the harder it becomes to accept that the public version of the story is complete. Antarctica is the 5th largest continent on Earth. It covers approximately 14 million square kilometers. 98% of its surface is covered by ice. The ice sheet averages 2.1 kilometers in thickness and reaches depths of nearly 5 kilometers in some locations. Under all of that ice is a real landmass with mountains, valleys, plains, lakes, and rivers that have not been exposed to open air in somewhere between 15 and 34 million years. The entire land mass of Antarctica, larger than Europe, is as completely hidden from surface observation as if it had been placed under an opaque covering of equivalent area. Satellite radar can penetrate the ice and map the topography beneath it, but radar imaging shows shapes and dimensions. It does not show what sits on the surface of the bedrock. A city of stone the size of London, sitting on the Antarctic bedrock under 2 miles of ice, would not be visible to radar survey in any detail that would distinguish it from natural geological variation. None of this is controversial. What is controversial is a different set of observations about Antarctica that sits alongside the scientific record without being properly explained by it. The first is the maps. There are several maps from the 15th and 16th centuries, drawn by Ottoman, European, and Arabic cartographers that show the coastline of Antarctica with a specificity and accuracy that should not be possible. The most famous is a map drawn by an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis in 1513. The Piri Reis map shows the coastline of a southern continent in a position and with a shape that corresponds to the actual coastline of Antarctica as it exists under the ice, not as it appears above the ice today. The coastline shown on the Piri Reis map does not match the visible ice shelf that modern explorers found when they first reached Antarctica in the 1820s. It matches the subglacial coastline that modern radar imaging has only recently revealed. This means that whoever made the original source maps for the Piri Reis map had access to information about Antarctica's actual landmass that was not available to any known civilization at the time the map was drawn. The second observation concerns the speed and scale of the military response to Antarctica in the years immediately following World War II. In 1946 and 1947, the United States Navy launched an operation called Operation High Jump under the command of Rear Admiral Richard E. Byrd. The operation involved 4,700 military personnel, 13 ships, and multiple aircraft. It was authorized for 6 to 8 months. It returned after approximately 8 weeks. The official explanation for the early return was weather. Military operations in Antarctica are not terminated early because of weather. Weather in Antarctica during the summer season is understood and planned for. The equipment, ships, aircraft, and personnel were all selected and trained for Antarctic conditions. Terminating a major military operation after 8 weeks, when it was specifically planned and equipped for months of Antarctic conditions, is not a satisfactory explanation on its face. The third observation concerns what radar imaging and satellite survey of Antarctica over the past 2 decades has revealed. The subglacial topography of Antarctica contains features that researchers have described in careful, qualified language in their published papers, but that the popular science media has largely not connected to the broader question of what lies under the ice. There are structures, features with angles and dimensions that have led researchers working with the satellite data to use descriptive language that, if applied to any other continent, will immediately trigger an archaeological investigation. Whether those structures are what the most aggressive interpretation of the evidence suggests is not established. What is established is that the features are there, and that no fully satisfying geological explanation for them has been published. The official history of Antarctica begins in 1820, when 3 separate expeditions, British, American, and Russian, made the first confirmed sightings of the continent. But the ancient maps suggest that the 1820 sightings were not the first time human beings had encountered or documented Antarctica's coastline. Piri Reis was an Ottoman admiral and cartographer who completed his famous world map in 1513. The map survived in fragments and was rediscovered in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul in 1929. In his own notes, Piri Reis stated that he had compiled it from approximately 20 source maps, some of which he attributed to the time of Alexander the Great. Whatever the source of the information, it represents knowledge of Antarctica that predates the official discovery by at least 3 centuries, and that exceeds in accuracy anything that conventional historical cartography can account for. The southern landmass shown on the Piri Reis map cannot have been drawn from direct observation in 1513, because the Antarctic coastline was not accessible to any known 16th century explorer, and because the coastline shown corresponds to the subglacial rather than the glacial surface. A second map, drawn by the French cartographer Oronteus Phineas in 1532, shows an even more detailed rendering of a southern continent that corresponds in its general outline to Antarctica, including river systems and mountain ranges in positions that correspond to features of the actual subglacial Antarctic landscape, as revealed by modern radar survey. Phineas died in 1555. He could not have had access to any expedition that had reached Antarctica. The question of what body of geographical knowledge these cartographers were drawing on has occupied researchers for decades without a satisfying conventional answer. Both the Piri Reis and the Phineas maps require a source with direct access to geographical information about Antarctica's actual landmass. That source has never been identified within the conventional historical framework. The question was examined seriously in the 20th century by an American historian named Charles Hapgood, who published a detailed analysis of the ancient maps in a 1966 book called Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings. Hapgood argued that the maps could only be explained as copies of source documents produced by a pre-Ice Age civilization with advanced navigational and cartographic capabilities, that this civilization had mapped Antarctica during a period when the continent was partially or wholly ice-free, and that copies of their maps had survived through successive recopying in ancient libraries. Hapgood's hypothesis was not accepted by mainstream academia, but it attracted the attention of Albert Einstein, who wrote the foreword to an earlier version of Hapgood's work and described his findings as genuinely novel and deserving serious consideration. Whatever Einstein thought of the specific conclusions, his willingness to associate his name with the inquiry suggests the question was not, at that point, considered beyond serious examination. The military history of Antarctica in the post-war period is a separate body of evidence that intersects with the cartographic mystery in ways that have never been fully reconciled. Operation High Jump was authorized by Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal, who would later become the first Secretary of Defense, and who died in controversial circumstances in 1949. The operation involved 4,700 military personnel, 13 ships, and multiple aircraft, authorized for 6 to 8 months. It returned after approximately 8 weeks. Admiral Byrd, in a press interview given to a Chilean newspaper in March 1947, shortly after his return, was quoted as stating that it was necessary for the United States to take defensive measures against the possibility of an attack by hostile aircraft capable of flying from pole to pole at incredible speeds. The statement was reported by the Associated Press and reprinted in multiple newspapers. It was never retracted by Byrd, and no American military official publicly corrected or contextualized it at the time. The operation's full records remain classified. The Antarctic Treaty of 1959 is the final piece of historical context that requires examination. The treaty was signed by 12 nations, including the United States and the Soviet Union at the peak of Cold War tension. It established Antarctica as a continent reserved exclusively for peaceful scientific research and prohibited military activity and independent territorial claims. It has remained in force for over 60 years. What the treaty does not explain is why the two powers that were in direct military competition on every other continent agreed to jointly and permanently demilitarize Antarctica at a moment of maximum geopolitical tension. The standard explanation is that Antarctica had no strategic or resource value significant enough to justify a competition. Subsequent confirmation of significant Antarctic oil and mineral deposits has complicated that explanation without replacing it. The concept of a great southern continent appears in ancient geographical thought well before any expedition had reached Antarctica. The ancient Greek astronomer Pythagoras proposed on theoretical grounds that the Earth must have a large landmass in the southern hemisphere to balance the known land masses of the north. The geographer Ptolemy, working in Alexandria in the 2nd century AD, included a southern continent called Terra Australis Incognita in his influential geographical writings and described it as inhabited. Ptolemy's Terra Australis was a standard feature of world maps for over 1,000 years before any European expedition came close to verifying it. But there is a critical distinction between a theoretical continent placed in the southern hemisphere for reasons of symmetry and a detailed map of an actual continent's subglacial coastline. Ptolemy's Terra Australis is a theoretical construct. The Piri Reis and Phineus maps are not theoretical constructs. They show specific coastlines with specific features that correspond to specific aspects of the actual Antarctic landmass. That correspondence requires a source. The connection between Plato's account of Atlantis and the Antarctic hypothesis has been proposed by multiple researchers since the early 20th century. Plato's account, presented in two dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, describes a powerful island civilization located in the Atlantic Ocean that was destroyed by a catastrophic flood approximately 9,000 years before Plato's own time, placing the destruction at approximately 9,600 BC. Plato describes Atlantis as a large island with mountains, plains, rivers, and a circular city of great sophistication. This timing coincides precisely with the end of the last ice age and the period during which Antarctica was in the final stages of becoming glaciated, based on ice core data. The debate over whether Plato's account is historical, allegorical, or invented has occupied scholars for over 2,000 years. The temporal overlap between the Atlantis timeline, the end of the last ice age, and the glaciation of Antarctica is specific enough to be worth naming clearly. The Vedic texts of ancient India contain references to a land of eternal darkness in the far south, a continent beyond the Southern Ocean, where the sun does not rise for months at a time. These descriptions are consistent with the experience of anyone who has spent time in Antarctica during its polar winter. Ancient Indian cosmological texts describe a southern continent and identify it as one of the 7 major landmasses of the world. Whether these references represent theoretical geography, genuine ancient knowledge, or mythological elaboration of travelers' accounts that have not otherwise survived is impossible to determine from the texts alone. What they confirm is that the concept of the significant southern landmass was present in multiple ancient intellectual traditions, and that at least some ancient descriptions of it include details consistent with actual Antarctic conditions. Taken alongside the cartographic evidence, the pattern points toward a body of ancient geographical knowledge about Antarctica that conventional history cannot account for. 5 main theories have been proposed to explain the accumulated anomalies of the Antarctic evidence. The first and most conservative holds that the ancient maps are the result of gradual geographical knowledge accumulation by pre-Columbian maritime cultures, whose voyages are not documented in any surviving historical record. Polynesian, Phoenician, or other ancient maritime peoples may have reached Antarctic waters during periods of reduced sea ice and made observations that eventually found their way into the maps that Piri Reis and Phineus compiled. This theory has the advantage of not requiring anything beyond human maritime capability. It has the disadvantage of not explaining why the maps show the subglacial rather than the glacial coastline, since any maritime explorer reaching Antarctic waters in the last several thousand years would have encountered the ice shelf, not the rock coastline beneath it. The second major theory, proposed by Hapgood, argues that the maps derive from a pre-Ice Age advanced civilization that had developed sophisticated cartographic capability while Antarctica was still partially or wholly ice-free. Their maps survived through successive recopying in ancient archives, eventually reaching the medieval and early modern cartographers who produced the surviving examples. This theory requires accepting that a technologically sophisticated civilization existed in the ancient world that has left no direct archaeological trace in the regions that have been investigated. It connects directly to the broader question of whether a pre-flood advanced civilization existed anywhere on Earth. The question this channel examined in the context of the Anunnaki tradition in Episode 6, and to the Antikythera mechanism examined in Episode 5, which demonstrated that the ancient world was mechanically capable of things we did not believe were possible until the physical evidence forced a revision. The third theory concerns Operation High Jump in the military history of Antarctica. It argues that the United States military encountered something during the 1946 and 1947 operation sufficiently alarming to cause an early withdrawal, that the nature of what was encountered has been classified and suppressed, and that the Antarctic Treaty was at least partly motivated by a desire to establish an international framework that would prevent independent investigation of whatever was found. This theory is supported by the circumstantial evidence of the early withdrawal and Admiral Byrd's unexplained press statements. It is weakened by the absence of any whistleblower testimony or leaked document that directly confirms what the operation encountered after nearly 80 years. The absence of such evidence is either proof that nothing unusual happened or proof that whatever did happen was suppressed at a level that has not been penetrated by subsequent declassification. Both interpretations are logically consistent with the available evidence. The fourth theory concerns the specific geometric anomalies identified in the Antarctic subglacial landscape. Several locations, particularly in the Queen Maudland region, show features with regular geometries and dimensions that some researchers have described as inconsistent with natural geological formation. The most widely discussed are 4 mountain peaks in the Ellsworth Range that appear in satellite imagery to have near-perfect pyramidal shapes with approximately equal faces. The mainstream geological explanation is that they are nunatarks whose pyramidal form is the result of glacial erosion from multiple directions over millions of years. This is a real geological process. What the mainstream explanation does not fully address is why these particular features appear so geometrically regular compared to other nunataks in the same region, and why the dimensions of the largest correspond approximately to those of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Whether this correspondence is meaningful or coincidental is a question the available data cannot resolve. The fifth theory is the most expansive. It argues that Antarctica was the original location of a technologically advanced civilization that was destroyed when the continent became glaciated at the end of the last ice age, that survivors or cultural memory of that civilization became the source of the ancient advanced knowledge that appears unexplained in the archaeological record of Sumer, Egypt, and the other early civilizations, and that the physical remains of that civilization are still preserved under the ice in cold storage. If it is correct, the single most significant archaeological site on Earth is currently inaccessible under 2 miles of Antarctic ice. And if the ice continues to melt at its current rate, it will eventually not be. Lake Vostok is the most significant subglacial lake in Antarctica, and one of the largest lakes on Earth by volume. It lies approximately 4 kilometers beneath the East Antarctic ice sheet and has been sealed under the ice for somewhere between 15 and 25 million years. Russian scientists began drilling toward Lake Vostok in the 1990s and broke through to the lake surface in February 2012. The water samples they retrieved showed evidence of microbial life that had been isolated from the surface world for millions of years. What else the samples showed has not been fully published. A complete scientific disclosure of everything retrieved from the lake has not followed in the years since. The Russian team published an initial paper on the microbial findings in 2013. Subsequent publication of a complete analysis has not appeared in the scientific literature. What was in the water of Lake Vostok, beyond the microorganisms that were reported, is not publicly known. The Wilkes Land anomaly is a gravitational anomaly in East Antarctica first identified by satellite gravity measurements in 2006. The anomaly is a massive concentration of mass beneath the ice sheet in a roughly circular pattern approximately 480 kilometers in diameter. The mainstream explanation is that it represents the remnant of an ancient meteor impact, the largest confirmed impact crater on Earth if the explanation is correct. An impact of the required scale would have been one of the most destructive events in Earth's recent geological history, releasing energy orders of magnitude greater than the impact that killed the dinosaurs. Whether such an event occurred and when has not been definitively established. Alternate explanations for the anomaly include unusual concentrations of dense minerals or geological structures that do not require an impact event. What is not in dispute is the anomaly's existence and its scale. An area approximately the size of the eastern United States lies under the ice of East Antarctica with a gravitational signature that current geological models do not fully explain. In 2018, a team from the British Antarctic Survey reported evidence of a geothermal heat source beneath the West Antarctic ice sheet with an intensity comparable to Yellowstone National Park. This heat source is relevant to the stability of the ice sheet and to the rate of its potential future melting. It is also relevant to what conditions might exist in subglacial regions exposed to this kind of geothermal activity. A subglacial environment with significant geothermal heat input is an environment in which liquid water exists, in which ice does not accumulate, and in which whatever lies on the bedrock surface is not necessarily frozen in place, but is in contact with moving, chemically active water. If any structures or artifacts exist on the Antarctic bedrock in regions of high geothermal activity, they may be in a very different state of preservation from what would be expected in a fully frozen environment. The subglacial lakes of Antarctica are not limited to Lake Vostok. As of the most recent comprehensive survey, over 400 subglacial lakes have been identified beneath the Antarctic ice sheet, connected to each other by subglacial drainage networks. Water flows between them through channels in the bedrock and at the base of the ice sheet. The subglacial hydrological network of Antarctica is a hidden river system the size of a continent that no one has seen directly. What flows through that network, what it has transported and deposited over millions of years, what lies on the shores of the lakes within that network, is not known. The lakes themselves, each one a sealed environment isolated from the surface world for millions of years, have been entered in only one case, and the full results of that entry have not been published. The Nazi German expedition to Antarctica in 1938 and 1939 surveyed a large area of the continent by aircraft and dropped markers to establish a territorial claim over the region called Neuschwabenland in what is now Queen Maud Land. The expedition was organized at the direct instruction of Hermann Göring. Its stated purpose was to identify a site for a German whaling station. The scale of the expedition has led researchers to question whether the stated purpose was the real one. The specific region claimed by Germany is the same region where subsequent satellite survey has identified the geometric anomalies that have attracted attention in more recent years. After World War II, a significant number of high-ranking Nazi officials were extracted from Germany through escape networks that passed through South America. Whether any of them had a connection to the Antarctic territory Germany had claimed has never been fully established. The question that Antarctica poses to conventional history is not simply whether something is buried under the ice. It is a question about what we accept as sufficient evidence to change our understanding of the past. The academic tradition of ancient history is built on the principle that claims require physical evidence. You cannot assert that a civilization existed in a specific place at a specific time without archaeological evidence from that place at that time. This is a good principle, but it has a vulnerability. The absence of archaeological evidence is routinely interpreted as evidence of absence. In the specific case of Antarctica, the absence of archaeological evidence is not the result of thorough investigation. It is the result of the fact that most of Antarctica has never been excavated, most of its subglacial surface has never been radar surveyed, and the international framework governing access to the continent makes independent archaeological investigation essentially impossible. The Antarctic Treaty, whatever its merits as a framework for peaceful scientific cooperation, has created a situation in which the most significant unknown territory on Earth is governed by rules that effectively prevent the kind of investigation that would settle the questions the ancient maps and the military history raise. Independent researchers cannot simply go to Antarctica and investigate. They need to be affiliated with one of the national programs operating under the treaty framework. Those national programs have scientific mandates that do not include searching for evidence of pre-Ice Age civilizations. A scientist who applied for a grant to search for evidence of a pre-Ice Age Antarctic civilization would not receive it. Not because the proposal would be reviewed and found implausible. It would not be reviewed. It would be filtered out as outside the scope of the program. The question has been pre-answered. The answer is no. And as long as the answer is given before the investigation is conducted, the investigation will not be conducted. There is a useful parallel in the history of the Antikythera mechanism, examined in episode 5. The mechanism was sitting in a museum storage room for nearly a year before a researcher happened to notice the gear wheel. The most important scientific instrument of the ancient world was overlooked, not because it was hidden, but because nobody looking at it knew what to look for. The Antarctic situation is structurally similar. The evidence that suggests something significant may lie under the ice is not hidden. The ancient maps are in major museum collections. The radar survey data is published in peer-reviewed journals. Admiral Byrd's press statements are in newspaper archives. The gravitational anomaly data is in publicly available satellite datasets. What is missing is not the evidence. What is missing is a framework within which the evidence is considered worth pursuing through systematic investigation. The rate at which the Antarctic ice is currently melting adds a specific urgency to this question. Multiple climate projections predict that significant portions of the West Antarctic ice sheet will be destabilized within the current century. The human consequences of this melting are the subject of urgent political and scientific attention. But the specifically archaeological consequence of the melting has received almost no attention. If anything exists under the West Antarctic ice sheet, the accelerating melt means that whatever protection the ice has provided for thousands of years is now ending. The generation alive today will see the first significant exposure of the Antarctic bedrock in regions that have been glaciated for thousands of years. What that exposure reveals will either confirm that there is nothing there beyond geology, or it will raise questions that the entire framework of ancient history will be required to answer. The question of what is under the ice is not just a historical question, it is a question with a deadline. Antarctica is the last great unknown on Earth. Every other continent has been walked, mapped, photographed, and excavated to a degree that makes large-scale surprises increasingly unlikely. Antarctica has not. The continent beneath the ice sheet is as unknown to modern science as the surface of Mars was before the first satellite images. The subglacial topography that radar imaging has revealed is the outline of a landscape that no human being has ever seen directly. What is in that landscape, what sits on the bedrock under the ice in the regions that have not yet been radar surveyed, is not known. It may be nothing. It may be something that changes everything. The Piri Reis map is in the Topkapi Palace Museum in Istanbul. Anyone can go there and look at it. The subglacial coastline data from modern radar surveys is published in scientific journals and available online. The two data sets, the 1513 map and the modern radar topography, can be compared by anyone with the patience to do it. Either the correspondence is there or it is not. And if it is there, the explanation for it is a problem that the conventional history of human civilization does not have a satisfying answer to. Admiral Byrd returned from Operation High Jump in 1947 and told a Chilean newspaper that the world needed to be prepared for a threat from hostile aircraft capable of flying from pole to pole at incredible speeds. He died in March 1957, less than a year before the Antarctic Treaty negotiations began in earnest. He never gave a full account of what Operation High Jump encountered. Whatever he knew about what lay under the Antarctic ice, he took it with him. The operation's full records remain classified. Every episode of this series has pointed in the same direction from a different angle. The Antikythera mechanism showed that the ancient world was mechanically capable of things we did not believe were possible. The Anunnaki tradition showed that the oldest written records on Earth describe a period of human history that the conventional account cannot accommodate. The Antarctic evidence shows that the maps of the ancient world contain geographical knowledge that should not exist. These are not three separate mysteries. They are three aspects of the same question: what existed before the events that ancient traditions consistently describe as a global catastrophe around 12,000 years ago? The Antarctic ice is the last barrier between us and whatever the answer is, and it is melting without anyone's permission. The ice is melting. The parts of Antarctica that are melting fastest are the parts that sit over the geothermal heat sources identified in recent surveys. The parts that sit over the gravitational anomaly in Wilkes Land, the parts where the bedrock topography shows features that a different interpretive framework would describe differently. Whatever is under the ice is getting closer to the surface, not in years, in decades. What that exposure reveals will either confirm that there is nothing there beyond geology, or it will raise questions that the entire framework of ancient history will be required to answer. They have known what is under the ice for decades. That is what the evidence suggests. Whether what they know is what we think they know is the question the ice itself is in the process of answering. And there is nothing anyone can do to stop it. The scale of what lies under the Antarctic ice deserves more careful attention than summary numbers convey. When researchers say that Antarctica is covered by ice averaging 2.1 kilometers thick, the practical implication is that the continent is invisible. Not difficult to access, not partially obscured, invisible. The entire landmass of Antarctica is as completely hidden from surface observation as if it had been placed under an opaque covering of equivalent area. Satellite radar can penetrate the ice and map the topography beneath it, but radar imaging is not the same as excavation. It shows shapes and dimensions. It does not show what sits on the surface of the bedrock, and the technology for systematic radar survey of the entire Antarctic subglacial surface has only been applied to a fraction of the continent's total area. What remains undetected under the portions of Antarctica that have not yet been radar surveyed is genuinely unknown. The subglacial lakes of Antarctica are among the most significant features of the continent's hidden landscape. As of the most recent comprehensive survey, over 400 subglacial lakes have been identified beneath the Antarctic ice sheet. These lakes exist because the pressure of the overlying ice, combined in some cases with geothermal heat from below, maintains liquid water at the ice-bedrock interface. The largest of these, Lake Vostok, is roughly the size of Lake Ontario and has been completely sealed under 4 kilometers of ice for between 15 and 25 million years. The subglacial hydrological network connecting these lakes is, in a real sense, a hidden river system the size of a continent that no human being has ever seen directly. What flows through that network, what lies on the shores of the lakes within it, and what the bedrock surface looks like in the regions between those lakes is not known with any detail. The specific details of Operation Highjump's early termination deserve more careful examination than the weather explanation provides. The operation was designed to be self-sustaining for 6 to 8 months and was equipped accordingly. The equipment, ships, aircraft and personnel were all selected and trained specifically for Antarctic conditions. Terminating a major military operation after 8 weeks because of weather, when the operation was specifically planned and equipped for months of Antarctic conditions, is not a satisfactory explanation on its face. It would require the weather to have been significantly worse than planning assumptions allowed for, and no such extraordinary weather event during the Operation Highjump deployment period appears in any historical meteorological record of the region. The early withdrawal has never been adequately explained by any official source, and no complete account of what the operation actually encountered has been released through any declassification process. The connection between the post-war rush to Antarctica and the broader context of wartime discovery is worth naming explicitly. The years immediately following World War II were a period in which governments were processing an enormous amount of captured intelligence, recovered technology, and scientific documentation from the defeated Axis powers. Germany had been conducting advanced research programs in multiple domains that yielded discoveries and capabilities that the Allied powers spent years analyzing and deploying. The German Antarctic expedition of 1938 and 1939 was organized at the direct instruction of the head of the German Air Force. What that expedition found and what documentation of its findings was captured by Allied forces after the war has never been fully disclosed. The possibility that the Allied post-war Antarctic operations were in part a response to specific information recovered from German wartime research is not established by any available evidence. But it is consistent with the timeline and the scale of the response. The specific detail in the Piri-Reis map that has received the least attention in popular discussions of the Antarctic cartographic mystery is the presence of a wide channel separating the southern continent from the tip of South America. This channel corresponds approximately to the Drake Passage, the body of water that separates the southern tip of South America from the Antarctic Peninsula. The Drake Passage is approximately 800 kilometers wide. For Piri-Reis to have shown it on his 1513 map with approximately the right width and in approximately the right position. The source maps he was copying must have depicted both South America and Antarctica at the same time as adjacent land masses separated by an open ocean channel. Showing two continents in correct relative position requires a level of cartographic sophistication and observational data that no theoretical assumption about a southern continent could produce. The Drake Passage was not officially discovered and named until the late 16th century. Piri Reis drew it in 1513. The question of what the international scientific community would do if radar survey of the Antarctic bedrock revealed unambiguous evidence of artificial structures is one that nobody in the mainstream scientific establishment has publicly addressed. The protocols for announcing discoveries of biological life on Mars have been extensively developed and debated by the scientific community. The protocols for announcing a discovery of archaeological significance on the Antarctic bedrock have not been. This asymmetry is itself informative. The possibility of life on Mars is considered a real possibility worth preparing for. The possibility of evidence of pre-Ice Age civilization on the Antarctic bedrock is not considered a real possibility by the institutions that govern Antarctic research. It is not prepared for. It is not planned for. And if it were discovered, there is no established framework for how the discovery would be evaluated, verified, announced, or managed. The absence of such a framework does not mean the discovery will not happen. It means that if it does happen, the institutions responsible for Antarctic research will be making decisions under pressure without a plan. The specific region of Antarctica most likely to show significant bedrock exposure in the near term is the West Antarctic ice sheet, particularly the Thwaites Glacier sector. Thwaites has been called the Doomsday Glacier by scientists because of its potential contribution to sea level rise, and it is retreating at a rate that has been accelerating over the past several decades. The bedrock beneath Thwaites sits largely below sea level, which means that as the glacier retreats, the exposed land will be inundated rather than dry. But the coastal margins of the West Antarctic ice sheet, the areas where bedrock rises above sea level, are also experiencing significant ice loss. These are the areas where any surface features on the Antarctic bedrock would first become accessible to direct observation. They are also the areas where the geothermal heat sources and the subglacial anomalies identified by recent surveys are concentrated. The ice cores extracted from Antarctica over the past several decades contain one of the most precise records of past climate available to science. Cores extracted from the deepest points of the Antarctic ice sheet contain ice formed from snow that fell approximately 800,000 years ago. The chemistry of the trapped air bubbles records the composition of the atmosphere at the time the snow fell. This record shows clearly that Antarctica has been glaciated continuously for the entire 800,000-year period covered by the deepest cores. The cores also show, however, that the transition from the last glacial maximum to the current interglacial period was not gradual. It was rapid, over a period of approximately 2,000 years. Beginning around 12,000 years ago, average global temperatures rose by several degrees and sea levels rose by approximately 120 meters. For any civilization that existed during the last glacial maximum, this transition would have been catastrophic. The ice cores tell us when this happened. They do not tell us what was there when it did. The specific testimony of people who have worked in Antarctica and who have reported anomalous experiences or observations is a category of evidence that deserves more careful attention than it typically receives. Military personnel who participated in Operation High Jump and who gave informal accounts of anomalous experiences during the operation represent one such category of testimony. Scientists who have worked at Antarctic stations and who have privately described features they observed in the radar data that they were instructed not to include in their published reports represent another. These accounts are individually unverifiable, but the pattern they form accounts from credible sources describing the same category of anomaly from different contexts and different time periods is a pattern that the mainstream account of Antarctic research does not explain. What would it take to settle the questions that the Antarctic evidence raises? The answer is specific and practical. It would take a systematic radar survey of the entire Antarctic subglacial surface at a resolution high enough to detect structural features at the scale of human construction. It would take the ability to drill to the bedrock at any point identified by the survey as warranting further investigation. It would take a scientific framework that treats the question of pre-Ice Age human presence in Antarctica as a legitimate scientific question rather than a fringe hypothesis. None of these things would be technically difficult. The technology for all of them exists. What it would require is the institutional will to ask the question seriously, and that institutional will, within the framework currently governing Antarctic research, does not exist. The pattern of what gets studied in Antarctica and what does not is itself informative. The scientific programs operating in Antarctica under the treaty framework are funded primarily by national governments and are directed by national scientific agencies. These agencies have mandates that include climate research, geological survey, astrophysics, and marine biology. They do not have mandates that include searching for evidence of pre-Ice Age human civilization. The scientists who work in Antarctica under these programs are genuine scientists doing genuine science. They are not part of a conspiracy, but the framework within which they operate is one that systematically excludes the specific investigation that would be required to address the questions raised by the ancient maps and the subglacial anomalies. Not because anyone has explicitly prohibited that investigation, but because the funding structures, the scientific mandates, and the professional incentives that govern Antarctic research do not support it. Every episode of this series has pointed in the same direction from a different angle. The Antikythera mechanism showed that the ancient world was mechanically capable of things we did not believe were possible. The Anunnaki tradition showed that the oldest written records on Earth describe a period of human history that the conventional account cannot accommodate. The Antarctic evidence shows that the maps of the ancient world contain geographical knowledge that should not exist. These are not three separate mysteries, they are three aspects of the same question. A question about what existed before the events that ancient traditions consistently describe as a global catastrophe around 12,000 years ago. The Antarctic ice is the last barrier between us and whatever the answer is, and it is melting without anyone's permission. The ice is the last locked door in this investigation. Every other door has been opened, at least partially, by the accident of preservation and the persistence of researchers willing to take evidence seriously, despite institutional resistance. The Antarctic door is being opened by something that no researcher ordered and no institution authorized: the simple physics of a warming climate. The closing question of this investigation is not whether something lies under the Antarctic ice. The question is what it means for our understanding of ourselves if something does. We have been wrong before. We were wrong about the Antikythera mechanism for over a year while it sat in a storage room. We have been wrong about the capabilities of ancient civilizations for over a century of modern archaeology. The pattern of being wrong in the specific direction of underestimating ancient human capability is consistent enough to be treated as a systematic bias rather than a series of independent errors. Antarctica is the place where that bias has had the most protection. Because Antarctica is the one place where the evidence, whatever it is, has been physically inaccessible for the entire period of modern scientific investigation. That physical inaccessibility is ending. The bias is about to be tested in the most consequential possible way. The ice is melting. Satellite data published over the past decade shows that the rate of Antarctic ice loss is accelerating beyond the projections that climate models made a decade ago. Whatever is under the ice is getting closer to the surface with every year that passes. Whether what lies there is bare rock shaped by ancient glaciation or something that requires a different explanation entirely is a question that the 21st century will force to the surface. The generation alive today will have an answer that no previous generation has had access to. Whether the institutions currently governing Antarctic research will be the first to see it, or whether the melt itself will make the question impossible to avoid, is the only thing that remains uncertain. They have known what is under the ice for decades. The ice is about to make sure the rest of us know too.